Foundation, welcome this evening. People are joining now. I see lots of faces, some familiar, all very friendly. So tonight we're kicking off our 5-part series, You Are What You Eat, Storytelling Through Food. So just a little bit about what we'll be covering tonight. We're bringing together 3 experts in nutrition and health and wellness and food justice and food systems for this series. And we'll learn some new recipes and think about how the recipes you cherish tell part of your story and reflect your identity and culture. And we'll learn about and consider how those recipes and ingredients connect to personal and environmental health. And we've got the right people online with us tonight to help us to do that. Lachelle Cunningham, Suan Kregel, and Breen are here. And just a note about us, Farm Table Foundation, we're the host of the series and happy to convene this event. Farm Table Foundation is in Amory, Wisconsin, about an hour northeast of the Twin Cities, and our mission is to grow local food culture. And we do that through a local food restaurant, a nonprofit local food restaurant, and an art gallery, and a really robust calendar of events and programs and classes like this one tonight. So I'm gonna turn it over to our presenters, and I hope you all really enjoy our time together tonight. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, my name is Suan Kregel. I am a local, wellness coach, but I also do a lot of work in the tech industry. So Lachelle and I met last summer during doing some advocacy work after the riots and doing some healing work within our community. And then also later we met Jenny, or connected with Jenny during the summer, and combined our passions around health, well-being, food systems, food culture. And then also we all come from very different cultures, not just racial backgrounds, but cultural backgrounds that show the diversity that lives within food culture. I'm looking at the main camera. Oh. Sorry, I was talking to the main camera. So if you want to see me here's my my face up close and personal. So I grew up here in Minneapolis. My mom's from West Africa. My dad's from Wisconsin. So that's always an interesting background. But I'm going to be showing you today, I'm going to be doing the rack of lamb, or the herb-crusted rack of lamb, sharing a bit of food culture from my mom's fancy kitchen.
Hi, everyone. Jenny here. Hi, folks. So as you can see, we're figuring out the logistics of being together on Zoom in a kitchen on multiple devices, which is incredibly complicated. And we're in a noisy space because we're in a professional kitchen in a school where I do some work. So my name is Jenny Breen, as Suan said. I've known Lachelle for several years. We travel in intersecting circles around food and community and education and food justice. And we have been talking for a long time about collaborating in some way. And so finally, Lachelle met Suan and started doing some work with her, and we found that we'd shared some really interesting ideas about food and culture and equity and access. And this is what came out of that. My background, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about our food stories, but my background is both my parents are the children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and I grew up with sort of a blend of Minneapolis and sort of Jewish traditions. Food is a really big part of Jewish culture and family, and I am now a professional chef and culinary nutrition educator. I teach classes at the university and also do a lot of community-based work in various organizations. And I will be preparing a tempeh dish, a tempeh ragu with a creamy polenta. And I'm going to pass on to Lachelle. We'll be doing a more detailed discussion about who we are. So these are just kind of quick intros.
I'm Lachelle Cunningham, and I'm a chef here in the Twin Cities. As you know, they already told you, been connecting with Suan and Jenny and talking for a while with both of them, probably as long as I've known either of them about connecting. So here we are. If you don't know about me, I'm known as a chef in the community, as Jenny said. Started out, I'm an entrepreneur, started out running my own catering business, and then ended up running Breaking Bread Cafe in North Minneapolis as a part of Appetite for Change. Need to tighten my strings here. As a part of Appetite for Change. And so did that for a while, but the entrepreneur in me called me back. And so I relaunched my business, Shell's Kitchen. And over that time of really doing that, I realized what my true calling is really in education and nutritional healing and food justice. And so that's when I started building the Healthy Roots Institute, where I focus on healing through 3 pillars, which I call the love of food, the art of food, and the business of food. And that includes workshops and retreats, culinary training, as well as food business education. I'm really passionate about impacting people through food and nutrition, and really reclaiming the narrative on food, that so many of us have different stories to speak to that. So I'm happy to be here. We're culminating one meal together. So I got one of my favorite dishes, which is collard greens, and I'm preparing a simple vegan version of that. And so we'll talk more about that as we get into things. So I am excited about that. Am I passing? All right. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We're going to get into talking about really why we're here. Okay. So, why are we here? So, no, ultimately, you know, food is very powerful. You know, it's an equalizer. It's a way for us to connect. It is a way for us to break down barriers with each other. And so that's really what we want to do, is really create that type of vibe between us and connect through food and learn from each other about our stories, about the recipes, and about this whole system that we're all a part of. And so I don't want to detract from too much. We'll talk a little bit about, have Suan tell us. Well, I'm going to start prepping my meal, actually. Well, continue prepping it. But Suan, why don't you tell us, why are you here?
All right, so we're all trying to do 2 things at the same time, if you haven't noticed. We all have a camera that's close to our food, and we all have a camera that's close to our faces. So we are going to do our very best to give our host and hostess time to spotlight the right camera, but there is a second camera right behind me. If you look through all 25 screens, you might be able to find it. But it is pointed directly at my food. We are not the Food Network, but we are trying really hard. So if you can find that other camera, I can actually show you the meal that I'm preparing. Oh, sure. So I'm going to start preparing. So Jenny and I were just talking. I'm going to start preparing our food. Jenny and I are going to start preparing, or I'm going to start preparing my food. Jenny's going to be the first one to talk about her story, but just to let you know what I'm doing, when it comes to the rack of lamb, it's actually a lot easier than a lot of people think, which is part of the reason I wanted to prepare it. It's one of those things I do when I'm trying to impress somebody, but they have no idea that it takes 30 minutes. It's actually as easy as making stir fry, as you'll see later in the series. But I'm going to go ahead and prep this and start searing it in my hot pan of oil. So you can see I have my avocado oil heating up. I have a little bit of salt in it because it adds flavor. And I'm going to be searing all the different sides of it.
So before you pass it on, can you just tell us what your connection is to the dish?
Oh, sure. So food for me, and the question from Lachelle was, could you tell what your connection is to the dish? Well, I grew up cooking alongside my mom, who is a West African immigrant. She's from Ghana. This is not a West African dish. What I learned from my mom growing up is that every single kind of cuisine can be part of your story as long as you have a passion for it and you understand it. in the sense that you're willing to try it. So my mom loves cuisine, like cooking high class cuisine. And so she just instilled a lot of these simple skills in me at a young age. So I'm able to prepare things like this without fear. So I don't necessarily even know that she taught me how to make this. I think because I understood how to make food, I read the recipe once and I just got it. So just want to show you how easy this is to make. But I'm going to start off by just salt, pepper, and searing it on all sides so it gets a nice little brown crisp. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jenny.
Awesome. Thank you, Suan. So we're kind of bouncing around in a couple ways. We've all started doing a little bit of preparation. I'm actually going to put my camera on my dish for a little while I talk. And Lachelle's question about what's your connection to the food. So much of, I mean, the title of this series is about food stories. And for us, each of us, I mean, so I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, and the first thing I ever do in any class I ever teach is I ask people to tell their food story. And the reason that I do that partly is because we all have a relationship with food. They're very different. It may have to do with memories or experiences we had as a kid. It may have to do with travel or something that we tasted in a different environment. It might have to do with somebody who taught us something, like Suan's mom or my mom. Or it may just have to do with some personal journey. And usually it's some combination of those things. But what it definitely does is it gives us context. And it gives us a sense of kind of who we are and what our relationship with food is. So I teach in a lot of different settings. I teach students at the university who are becoming doctors and nurses and nutritionists. And one of the things, shockingly, maybe you all already know this, but our medical system and our healthcare system doesn't really do that. It doesn't really explore people's stories and people's contexts. And yet, it's really critical that we understand each other's stories before we try and heal, and before we try and respond to an individual's food needs and food context. They're all very, very different. And so part of why we wanted to do this series was to talk about each of our stories and what led us to where we are in relationship to food. I mean, obviously, Lachelle and I both make our livings through food. Suan makes her living through wellness. So there's definitely a connection there. But the food story is really important. So I'll give you a brief story. We each have a session on our own that we will be delving into these more deeply, but I'll give you my brief story. I'll pass it on to Lachelle and then back to Suan, and we'll kind of keep going around. And at that time, we'll also tell you a little bit about what we're cooking. So as I said,
Jenny, if you'll let me just interject, we can see your dish and what's happening on the stove, but we are only catching your profile now and then. Can we see your face too, possibly?
Oh, sure. I think the food is far more interesting than me. But
maybe a little bit of both, a good balance.
I'll go back and forth. So I'll talk a little bit about my story and then I'll tell you about the food and we'll look at the food. So as I mentioned, I'm the grandchild of Jewish immigrants. Actually, 3 of my 4 grandparents I never met because they all died much younger, and passed on some interesting and challenging health conditions in our family that also contribute to my food story. I watched my dad struggle for a long time with health and food, and so I knew that part of what I cared about was making sure people had healthy relationships with food and that food was nourishing and feeding someone's well-being instead of making it more difficult and complicated. I didn't really know what that was going to look like. I spent a year living on a kibbutz in Israel, and that just dramatically changed my view of the United States and society and indulgence and excess. And somehow that all came out in food and cooking food and feeding people and making sure that people had what they needed to be healthy, whether it was in the community or individually, became really important, and it kind of became what drove everything that I did. So I'm very lucky now. I was able to study public health nutrition after spending 20 years running a restaurant and a catering business. And now I get to combine the food from the culinary side and the nutrition side. And I love to introduce and engage people around delicious, wholesome food that makes them feel good and that gives them power and control over their own health. So I'm going to turn it back to the food and tell you a little bit about what I got going on here. So I'm using tempeh. Tempeh, you might just have to turn it down. Tempeh is a fermented soy. It's actually an inoculated soy cake, kind of made out of soybeans. Sounds pretty weird, but it's actually really, really good for your gut. It's got all this great good bacteria. It's the traditional protein in Indonesia, and this is actually a local brand that was locally produced, so it's a fresh tempeh. And it's just a really high quality protein alternative to meat. I don't like to call it a substitute because it's delicious on its own. And then I've just got some onions and yellow squash and mushrooms sauteing here. And if you had a chance to look at the recipe, I've just combined all of the seasonings and the apple cider vinegar and the tomato and the maple syrup ahead of time. So that's really going to make my sauce. And then I also separately created some polenta, which is just a coarse cornmeal cooked in milk or water or stock into kind of it's just kind of like a breakfast cereal or dinner cereal. Porridge. Grits is the white corn version. This is the yellow corn version. So I'm just playing around with all this deliciousness. It's obviously winter in Minnesota, so there's not a lot of local ingredients, but still my tempeh is local. My mushrooms came from a local mushroom grower. So I try as much as possible to find what makes sense in season and put it all together. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to pass it on to Lachelle so we can hear more about her.
All right, thank you. This is awesome. So much action and fun going on in the kitchen. You guys are seeing like 3 different dishes get prepared right before your eyes. Please excuse us for all the technical difficulties with the sound and the cameras, but I'm having a good time with this. We're connected in the kitchen over food, and the smells are here and all of that. Yes, and we do have recipes. I think the recipes were actually sent out ahead of time. So you all should have received those. Each one of our recipes we shared. But a little bit about me and my story and why I'm here. Food is near and dear to me. It's always been a part of my life. I've been cooking since I don't even know when I started cooking, when I could. And I, experienced that through my family gatherings and things like that were like the big celebration part of it. But on a day-to-day, just learning from my mom how to cook, just regular staples for the family. She was a traditional cook. She taught me how to read recipes and how to mise en place before I even knew what mise en place was, what mise en place is a French term, which basically means to set up or to put everything in its place. And it's a French term, but it's a culinary term. And us chefy folk like to use that type of term. But ultimately, when your recipe, when you're reading it, it has the ingredients at the top and it might say 1 onion minced or chopped or 1 clove of garlic minced. You have to do all of those instructions before you can actually start the instructions of the recipe. So that's technically your mise en place, is gathering all your ingredients and cutting them. So anyway, my mother taught me about that. My father taught me how to use spices and flavors. I called him the Spice King. I learned how to be messy in the kitchen from him. So I had to go to culinary school to unlearn that. But that was cool later in life. And then my stepmom actually taught me how to be an improvisational cook and to cook just off of what I have in my kitchen. And so that really started something. And then later on in life, as I became an adult, I learned my own style of cooking. And that's when I gave my own identity to it. But it wasn't until I became a mom, I didn't even know I wanted to be a chef until I became a mother. When I became a mother, actually through childbearing, your body physiologically changes when you become pregnant. And my sense of smell, that's when I say I got my superpower of smell, and I call it bionic smell. And so that's when my palate changed and my relationship with food changed. And I got a gift at that point. And so I've been trying to share that gift and impact people with that gift ever since. On another note, I'm on a personal journey for myself, for my own health, for understanding my family history, for understanding my lineage, and wanting to create something, a legacy to pass down to my children. And so in that, it's a lot of healing, it's a lot of uncovering trauma, it's a lot of uncovering things from the past, being a Black woman and having a past where there's so many missing pieces and pieces that were covered up or taken away. And so trying to piece that back together and really understand food and the impact that it has on us, and take it from something that can cause so much disease and also but also that can be something that can heal. And so I believe in that wholeheartedly. I do a lot of plant-based cooking. If you find me out there in the interwebs, you'll find out that I do a lot of different cooking classes where I focus on nutritional healing. I love plant medicine. I bought all kind of books and things that I study nutritional healing in foods. And so let's get into my recipe, because my onions are starting to caramelize further than I wanted. But basically I teach a lot about soul food and soul food history, and how soul food was created through basically, what we know of as slavery today. The term was coined in the 70s during the civil rights movement, but the foundations of soul food, going from slavery to tracing back to Africa and indigenous roots and really understanding what that means. But during slavery, the slaves were only rationed maybe a little bit of throwaway meat, some cornmeal, and maybe some molasses. And from that, they had to create nutrition for themselves and figure out survival. And so they did that by supplementing their diets, foraging, fishing, gardening, hunting, living off the land ultimately and knowing, plant nutrition and knowing what was harmful and what wasn't. And so from that, I really celebrate that as being more of the earth and more plant-based than what we might think of as soul food today, which is really heavy in a lot of fats and sugars and things like that, which we all love, but we got to kind of try to figure out how we can break those cycles of unhealthiness. And so usually collard greens traditionally have been made with ham hocks or fat back and pork. This recipe is completely vegan. So, and you can take this same recipe if you are a meat eater. I like meat. I'm not vegan. I'm plant-based, so I eat mostly vegetables. But if you wanted, you could actually cook down. I love turkey tails in my greens, smoked turkey tails. So if you cook, they have a lot of fat, but they have the best flavor. So if you cooked those down, maybe instead of the pork, I actually think they taste better than pork. And so you could cook those down until they fall apart, and then add them into this dish, or cook them in with your greens. I already cleaned my greens, which is a major process. Well, not major, but I triple wash my greens. So washing them 3 times to make sure you get all of the dirt and grit out of them. Tearing them
Lachelle,
down.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can hear you really well when you're speaking into the
Okay.
camera and when you're at a profile, but if you turn it all away from it, then it's hard to hear.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll put you over here for a second. So, that better? So I can actually stir and talk to you guys. So, where was I?
We were talking about triple washing your collard.
Oh, so I triple wash my collard greens. I have my collard greens boiling over on another burner. I'll bring those over. They're just simmering. They've been on for about an hour. You can cook them for 45 minutes or up to 2 or 3 hours, depending on how tender you like them. So I cook them separately with just a little bit of salt in the water and some bay leaves. And then I make what my mom always refers to as a bouillon. but it's really just an intense flavored sauce ultimately. So I teach culinary arts and we talk a lot about building flavors. So I do that. That's why you saw me cook my onions down first, because that's one level of flavor. Then I added my garlic, which is another level of flavor, and I'm toasting the garlic. You might see a little caramelization on my onions, which is good. That's called a Maillard reaction, when the sugars start to caramelize from the heat, and it creates not only the color, but the flavors and the aromas that make food delicious. Okay, that was a little culinary tip. So anyway, cooking this down, I'm gonna cook this for a few more minutes, and then I'm gonna add diced tomatoes to it, and I'm gonna cook that down. And then ultimately I'm going to, it's about a 20-30 minute process of this, and then I'll add it to my greens, cook it down together, and then season it to taste. I will put oregano in there. I'm also actually gonna add an ingredient that wasn't on your recipes. In celebration of African ingredients, I'm gonna add some harissa. I'm not concerned with the label, it's just about the sauce, which is a red pepper, North African red pepper sauce, and a Moroccan technically. And so I'm gonna add some of this in here now. It's kind of gonna act like a tomato paste in a sort of way. And I didn't measure, that was probably about 2 tablespoons, a tablespoon and a half, maybe. So I'm gonna cook that down a little bit with my onions and garlic, and then I'm gonna add in my tomatoes and cook that down. And this is gonna add a spiciness and another level of flavor to my dish. I actually make harissa from scratch usually. It's a great condiment to have around. So something you can do to it if you look it up. Google a recipe, it's easy. So anyway, with that, I'm gonna keep cooking and pull this together, and I'm gonna actually pass it over back to Suan. Yeah. And tell us more. Yes, and she's gonna tell us more, Suan. Back to you.
Okay. So it's back to me. So I'm going to start with what I've done since I last spoke to you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I'm good. I'm assuming silence means good. So I have been searing my lamb, maraca of lamb. Almost called a lamb shank, that would be wrong. And then like the recipe I sent you, I did a mixture of flat leaf parsley, thyme, garlic, and avocado oil. I'll talk a little bit more about the ingredients that I chose and why, but I'm very, very careful and very specific about how I shop, even when it comes to traditional ingredients. So remember, this was just patted dry, salt and pepper. This is actually a Kirkland rack of lamb. So these run, I don't know, one size like this is like $18. And then I call them lamb lollipops when they're done, because you can cut them in between each rib. And then they're really fun to take to work for, well, I guess when people are back at work, but they make great leftovers. So the day after, they actually taste just as good as the day that you make them. I recommend a slow reheat. But anyway, seared it in a pan so that we are cooking the outside to seal juices inside before we roast it. So the oven is on in the back, which is probably why we have to yell, because there's a hood in the back of the kitchen that will not turn off. So at one point it might get really quiet in here, and then we all can do a sigh of relief. But anyway, so now that this is seared, salt and peppered, I put together my herb mixture. So like Lachelle, I did something that's not in your recipe. The thing about herb mixtures like this is you get a good base, and then basically if it smells good, it's going to taste good when it comes to these basic herbs. So thyme, parsley, I mean, you could even add basil in here, but I added a little bit of rosemary for the chefs in the room, and then a little bit of lemon zest just to brighten up the flavor of it. And then salt. Salt. As long as it's good quality salt, but I'll talk more about that. It's not bad for you, pending health conditions. So now that I have this done, I'm gonna get my hands a bit dirty, and I'm going to give my rack of lamb the massage that I wish I could have gotten every week during this during this pandemic. So I'm just gonna live through my lamb. So the meatier parts need the love. There's this nice crease in here, so it's always good to get additional pieces in, but it's important to have salt and or even some acid in this because it'll really work its way into the meat. So just really get in there. Doesn't a deep tissue massage sound amazing right now? Well, it's gonna go in a 400-degree oven, so we can't get too mad, right? Until then, this lamb is living it up. Okay. So one tip I wasn't actually able to do this round. Usually what I'll do is take really hot oil and actually sear even the back here. My induction plate was acting weird and it wasn't getting hot enough. So make sure that if you can't get a sear on the back here, that you are getting oil and the like herb mixture marinade back there, because at least you'll have some hot oil so the skin will cook faster than the inside. Again, making sure that you're really trapping in the moisture. And then don't forget to get the ends too. So you don't want to create a burrito. Everything just sprays out the sides. All right, so that is my lamb. And I'm gonna go throw this in the oven and then I can actually tell the rest of my story once my hands aren't disgusting.
You want to pass it to Jenny and you can talk a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in while Swan goes and cleans her hands, and we tried to get her to massage some of that herb stuff on us too, like that, but she wouldn't do it. So we're gonna kind of just continue with more about the food story and kind of issues that are near and dear to us that we are trying to express in part through this conversation and through the food that we're making. Every time Lachelle or Suan says something, I think, oh yeah, I want to talk about that too. I'm really, as I mentioned, I'm really excited and passionate about the chemistry part of cooking. I think it's so fascinating. Like when Suan talked about putting a little acid on the meat, well, that helps break down and tenderize the meat. And then when you cook it, you actually get a Maillard reaction with the meat because of the fat and the heat. So there's this fascinating chemistry that I think is really cool. And that chemistry is also connected to the chemistry in our own bodies, right? So our bodies understand real food in its real form. Everything that we're making here is food that is the way nature creates it, right? We're using ingredients that are whole and fresh and I mean, minimally processed. Obviously the polenta that I'm using was ground up, but it's ground up whole corn. So it is exactly what it was when it grew, you know, and it's really important. And I work with a lot of folks who have patients and clients who really are struggling to understand what to choose and how to eat and what's best for their bodies. And I can say every person is an individual, and at the same time, whole food, the way nature makes it, is pretty much always the right choice. It's always the best choice. And you can get into the specifics of vegetarian, vegan, meat. I personally believe that as Lachelle spoke, and I'm the same way, I'm not a vegetarian, I'm not a vegan, I'm not keto, I'm not anything. I just eat almost or primarily plants. So my diet is really plant forward, and I think that really is the best for us, and it's also the best for the environment. I'm really passionate about food systems and sustainability, and part of why I choose to buy local is because I want to support local producers and people who are really working with the land to get quality food to us, who are in no way getting compensated as much as they should be, but are doing that work anyway. So whatever I can do to rebuild our food system, which is relatively unhealthy right now, but to contribute to a healthier food system by choosing food, as Suan said, she's very intentional about all the ingredients and how and where she gets them. And I feel the same way. I think having conversations like this and learning about each other as we share meals and share our experiences in the kitchen is also a really important part of rebuilding our food system, because even though we come from really different backgrounds, we have a lot more in common, and food is one of those ways to really make that connection. So I'm going to pass it back to Suan because she hasn't really told us as much about her food story as we want to know.
Jenny,
Oh,
a
yeah.
question for
Ever
you while
since
you're.
I told people that I'm part of a cooking and culture class, they were like, how did you get hooked up with it? And I laugh a lot about it because I feel like it was very serendipitous. So my food story goes back to, as I mentioned earlier, my mother's love of food. So from a very young age, she grew up in Ghana, and she grew up in an upper class home. So they were fortunate enough to have extended family members who come in and live and work to support themselves as they went to school. And then also it gave my family an opportunity to invest in the broader community. Well, when my mother was 8 years old, she became head of the kitchen. So you can imagine the boss nature of her personality. So she would talk about getting up in the morning. She would walk down to the market because she lived in a village or a small town near the ocean. She would pick out the ingredients, and then she would walk back and she'd prepare these meals for her family. And when she wasn't in boarding school and all of her siblings were home, there were 7 of them, plus extended family, plus her parents, and like her aunts and her uncles and her grandparents and everybody, because anybody could stop by at any time. So giant pots of food. And they also ran a charitable home downtown, so they would take food there to make sure that extended family members who couldn't or were in tough situations could be taken care of. So then from there, she decided to go to London to put herself through nursing school when she was 18 and learn to cook from. A lot of her classmates were Asian, so from different Asian countries. Learned to cook Asian food, developed her love of food even further. And then when she came to the States to be with my dad and have us, she just fully invested in food. So I learned to cook. I learned to bake when I was in elementary school. I learned how to cook hot food when I was, an older elementary school, like probably around 9 or 10, when we could be trusted with a spatula and a hot pan. And what I didn't realize at the time was that she was teaching me what a balanced diet looked like. In her culture, it's about vegetables and some kind of a healthy protein and usually rice. So I always joke around that I should have a t-shirt that said "This body was built by rice," because that was every single meal growing up. Was usually had some kind of a rice component to it. But it was healthy. It was usually had fish in it. It had chicken. It was a balanced meal. Like being a teenager in the US, right, in the 90s especially, I leaned into that culture in high school, started to gain weight, was not very healthy, happy with my body, started to develop depression, and I didn't really understand the correlation between not eating well and not feeling well and not feeling mentally well. When I went to college, I decided to change it all up. So I started actually studying bodybuilding, of all things. So I was joke that like these guns were created in my 20s, but are maintained in my 30s. Started studying bodybuilding and started learning about how carbohydrates can negatively affect your body. And then when I graduated from college, I started getting into the bulletproof world. So intermittent fasting and keto before it was really popular. So it's been 10 years for me. And what I learned through that process was that the protein you choose matters. The quality of the oil matters. Everything in a recipe can be enhanced if you're very intentional about the source. So one of the reasons I picked lamb today is because it is not typically a mass-produced meat. Therefore, it tends to be smaller farms. They tend to be fed a more natural diet. I mean, this isn't always the case, but it very often is. So like the Kirkland lamb is actually from New Zealand. So there's lots of green grass there for lambs to run around. I trust that it's a healthier meat. The reason I specified avocado oil in the menu is because it is not an industrial oil. So you can read more about this and I won't go super deep into it, but industrial oils are mass produced. They tend to be vegetable oils and they actually create a lot of inflammation in the body. Yep. And yes, and what Jenny is saying is the way that they're produced is highly toxic. So think about it this way. How do you get oil out of a corn kernel, right? These companies will use solvents. They will use high heat methods that actually produce trans fats inside of that oil. And oftentimes they will like degas these oils after they produce them, meaning that there's also residue inside of that oil. So as much as vegetable oil is called healthy or is thought to be healthy, it is not, and it is actually bad for our environment simultaneously. So usually what people use use vegetable oil is high heat cooking so that you have a higher smoke point and you don't gas your house whenever you try to fry something. Avocado oil has a very high heat point, and also it is way better for our environment and it's way better for our bodies because of the concentration of fats in it. When we talk about organic or the herbs that I picked, organic food is produced in a better way for the environment, and then also you get to avoid those pesticides, although there's some controversy around it. I specified high mineral dense salt because it is actually better for your body. So not all salts are created equally. I noticed Jenny and I are using the same the same salt. It's called real salt. Like I can pick it up at Lakewinds, you can get it at Byerly's. I think they sell it at Whole Foods, so it's pretty easy to get. But this is locally mined or in the U.S. and then also it is minerally dense. So you get a lot of those micronutrients that are naturally occurring in the soil in a normal dosage that you won't get. Now, the one thing I'll say about salts like this is that they usually don't have iodine added. So you gotta watch that for some people's diets, but that's really the only like downside I'd say to using a high grade mineral salt like that.
Would you?
Yeah, so that's the main reason that I picked it. Because of my diet, ever since my late 20s, when I really started consistently doing more ketogenic, intermittent fasting style dieting, I've naturally just lost weight consistently over time. And now I will say that I live a pretty healthy diet. Like I lift weights, I try to stay active, so that's part of it. But I really do believe that if you have the right diet, you don't really have to push yourself to exercise to excess in order to develop, to feel vivacious. And then also you naturally lose weight or start to reduce puffiness and inflammation. And so you start looking better too. But focusing on the quality of the food and the recipes and how you can enhance them in order to make sure that you're nourishing your body is essential. So my whole journey started with a traditional African upbringing of healthy foods, nutritionally dense, fell into the prey of American lifestyle and felt like absolute garbage. And then through exploring my own body, getting my degree in exercise or in kinesiology or health sciences, started to learn about that chemistry, and then was lucky enough to learn about keto and intermittent fasting and anti-inflammation diets at a relatively young age. So I'm really passionate about passing that on, and I also teach people how to do structural lifts and make sure that they can move their bodies as well as use their minds. So that's my food story, and that's how I ended up with these two lovely ladies.
So I definitely want to touch on, or I was inspired while Suan was speaking to say some things, but maybe you guys were able to see the camera, maybe not, but I'm now to the point where I brought over my collard greens, and let me turn it down so it's not boiling so hard. I brought my pot of collard greens over. Sometimes I'll drain off more of the liquid before I put the tomato mixture in there, but I just wanted to have more liquid this time because I've just been reading up on ancient or ancestral healing remedies, and pot liquor is actually a really strong, high nutrient, basically food. And the pot liquor is actually the liquid that's in the greens. So all of those, all of that nutrients from the collard greens and all of the other vegetables I put in here and the herbs I put in here is now in that water. So it's a really intense nutritional bomb there, and almost I would say up there with chicken soup, the way people think of chicken soup. But anyway, I put my mixture in there after I had cooked it down. It got some good caramelization on the bottom of the pan. You could see those little pieces were sticking. We call that fond, and that's where a lot of flavor is. So I actually took some of the juices out and loosened that up from the pan before I got rid of the pan so I could get all that flavor into this pot. Now, sometimes what I would do is actually have a pot that I cook everything down, the aromatics down into, and then I would pour the greens over the top so that I don't lose any of that flavor from that's cooked down in the bottom of the pan. But I turned it down a little too far. So now I'm literally just gonna stew this until we're ready. You don't have to cover it, I'm just covering it. I'm gonna season it to taste in a little bit. I'm gonna borrow some of Suan's pepper, and I got the real salt here also, which is good stuff. One thing I did want to talk about as far as my food story and why I really get into the nutritional healing aspect and the healing power of foods, and thinking about how we can utilize like even a pot liquor or all of the nutrients that are in all of these dishes, and how healing and nutritious that is for our bodies. I've been a believer in plant medicine and natural remedies since as long as I can remember. And it all goes back to my mom having this herbal remedies book. And it was like just the run of the mill herbal remedies book. But when I was a kid, and I don't know, anything from a cold, a flu, a fever, I would go to that book. And I found using the remedies actually had better results than me trying to take a NyQuil or some other over-the-counter medication to deal with some of the things that actually helped to heal me more than just deal with the symptom. And so I always knew from a young age, just from experiencing that food had and that I could essentially heal myself from anything nutritionally or through herbs and different things like that. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't go to doctors for the reason they need to, but I think if we can empower ourselves to know what's around us, honestly, most of the healing herbs and plants that I'm learning about are right in my backyard. Things that we think about as weeds, things that we think that we mow down, that we put chemicals on to kill, are actually here for us to heal our bodies. And not only is it because just good that they're great plants in our backyards, but the fact that they're in our local ecosystem actually makes them that much more powerful to induce healing in our bodies, because they're in our local environment and they've adapted to this environment. And when we get diseases in that environment, those plants have learned how to adapt to those things that are in our environment as well. And so they actually help us. Different plants have different, qualities and characteristic properties. Exactly. And so just knowing that dandelions, plantain, the little leaf that grows between the cracks in the sidewalk, is actually delicious. I made pesto with it. And it's nutritious and it's good for bug bites, topical applications. Creeping Charlie, some people can be allergic to it, but it can be great for respiratory, bronchial. You do have to know whether you're allergic to these plants. You can't just start taking a bunch of them. You got to test things out. But that's what you're doing with any medication anyway, right? And so violets, I mean, pretty much everything. Hostas, when hostas come out of the ground in the spring and they look like little shoots of asparagus, that's when you can actually cook those up like asparagus. I mean, pretty much all of the stuff back there is edible. We've made pastas. I've made dandelion wines, teas, drying the roots of the dandelions. There's a lot of dandelions in my backyard, and I felt like every time I pulled them up, like 1,000 more came out, which was great. But so yeah, just knowing clover, and knowing what the properties of these things are right in our backyard and how they can help us is to me phenomenal and life changing, and something that we really need to embrace more and understand. I have this book that talks about that a little bit, Backyard Medicine. I also got Sean Sherman's book is really awesome. Jenny Breen's book is here. So we've got lots of resources that can help us with healing, and a lot of it's at our fingertips. I'll say one last thing. I live in North Minneapolis, not too far from Theater Worth. And so I go foraging over there a lot, and there are dozens. I've identified over 30 plants, medicinal healing plants, trees, berries, that's just right out there, that's food and nutritional for us. And that the more that we can understand that and embrace that, the closer we can get to back to recovering some of the things that have been lost, right? Because our food system, as Suan mentioned, the standard American diet being sad and basically mostly made up of processed foods and meat. The small percentage of vegetables, half of that is like fries and ketchup. So, we've really gotten away from where our food comes from, connecting to our food, cooking together, building community together through food, and healing ourselves through food. And so to me, I'm really passionate about that. And I thank you all for listening to me. I'm gonna pass it over to Jenny so she can talk about finishing up her dish. And I think that Ron is finishing her dish. So awesome.
Jenny.
Yes, I know there's some questions, so we can start with those.
Sure. So I'll ask you the two questions. You can respond back to back. Wondering about the brand of avocado oil, for example, that Suan recommends. And then someone would like to hear a little bit more about tempeh, especially the health benefits of tempeh.
Awesome. So I will say, and I think this is really important because it's so confusing. I get questions all the time. What kind of oil should I buy? What brand? Honestly, the most important thing is that you know what it is, right? So if it's 100% avocado oil and you're buying it from a reputable place, whether that's the food co-ops or Costco, the most important thing is that you know what you're getting. And so I personally usually, and people ask me this about olive oil too, I usually tell people buy what's on sale because, it's hard to know. I mean, obviously in our global food system, sometimes it's hard to know what we're getting, but trust your suppliers. So buy from suppliers that you trust. And if you need to know more, if you have questions, ask those people. You're the consumer, you're spending the money, you deserve to get information. If the person who's supplying your groceries doesn't have that information, maybe look somewhere else. I mean, there are many high quality brands. I don't know what brand Suan's is, but yeah, she can talk. It's Primal Kitchen. So this is a keto sort of brand that's selling a lot of these high quality fats. I think what I want to emphasize, and you can say more, Suan, is what Suan already said about making sure that whatever ingredient you're choosing, it's a high quality version of that ingredient. So think a little bit, think critically, and we're here to help guide you. And all of the things that we're talking about, we have spent years studying and learning. So find people who you trust, who have been studying and learning, who can give you guidance. But I would say, vegetables don't have oil in them. And so what the heck is a vegetable oil, right? So sometimes we just have to trust our intuition and go back to that. I think all of us are talking a lot about trusting what we did on our own, was our own personal journey of listening to our bodies, listening to our intuition, noticing what we felt like when we ate one way versus another way, and really honing in on what are the things that make me feel nourished and healthy and energized, and where do they come from? And almost all the time they come from nature, right? And they're just real food. So I'm sure there's a lot more we can say about that. I also wanted to comment on the salt thing, because again, with health professionals, I get a lot of questions about salt because there's so many issues with people having too much salt in their diets. But 99.9% of that salt comes from the highly processed food that you're consuming. You could never salt your food to excess, right? It would taste, you wouldn't be able to eat it by that time. So if you're cooking your own food and controlling how much salt you're putting in, you don't really have to worry about that. And that's true for fat. It's true for all of these things that our bodies need, but need in their natural forms. And then just a question about tempeh. So it is a fermented, so what they do is they take the beans that are cooked to make tofu. They take the milk from those beans and turn that into tofu. And when I say, the companies or the people who made, as I said, it's a traditional Indonesian food. They take the beans and they actually inject them with a mold, which I know sounds kind of weird, but a bacteria that's really a quality, nurturing, healthy for your gut bacteria. And they kind of let that mold grow all over the tempeh. And then it becomes like this firm, chunky cake or block. And you can crumble it up and it kind of looks a little bit like ground beef, or you can use it whole or cut it into cubes like I did. So it's just a wonderful whole version of soy. So there's whole soy products like tofu, tempeh, and miso. And then there's highly processed soy products like the soy protein powder in protein drinks or in veggie burgers that are 25 ingredients. Those are really different. So soy is a really excellent high quality protein in its whole form. And then when we start to break it down, whether it's soy or corn or anything, as soon as we start to break it down and turn it into something else, our bodies don't really understand it anymore. So, and I was just gonna comment generally we didn't know how this evening was gonna go, and we're kind of going with the flow, but what's really clear to me is how complementary each of our paths, each of our journeys has been, and how each of us, like I said, kind of had this individual personal experience and then looked out into the environment and figured out how can this environment and I be, symbiotic? How can we take care of each other, right? Because if we don't take care of the environment, we can't really take care of ourselves and vice versa. So I love how each of us has kind of gotten to that point from really different paths, and will continue to travel down that path. I'm going to pass it over to Suan because she has pulled her meat out, and then I think we're going to plate all of this, which is going to be beautifully combined. I'm, of course, sorry that you all can't be here to eat it. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry you can't smell this. Sorry. Miscoordination for a hot minute. I'll add on a little bit to what Jenny said. So when it comes to oil, like Jenny was saying, the easiest thing to do is go to a supplier that actually picks things that are good for you. Now, it's really hard when you're at regular grocery stores because a lot of the time they're just responding to the market. They're responding to what people typically ask for. So one way you can also influence your local grocery store is by asking for very specific things that you know or that you've researched are good for you. Now, the reason I love Primal Kitchen is because they started off as a paleo brand. They support keto in a lot of ways, but from a paleo specific position where it's supposed to be all natural and processed foods. So they have an entire line of salad dressings as well that don't have any of those industrial oils. Like Bulletproof Executive is another company that does really well processed oils that support your body instead of creating inflammation. So the three oils that I keep in my kitchen are olive oil, coconut oil, and avocado oil, because avocado oil is a great high heat cooking oil. Coconut oil is great for medium cooking, and then olive oil, usually you should just focus on low heat cooking or just salad dressings and cold because they have different heat levels that you should keep them underneath. And so you want to make sure you're maintaining as much of the nutritional quality as possible. Because again, if you heat oil too much, like if you fry with an olive oil, you actually put your oil at risk of switching to or producing trans fats because it is smoking, right? Because smoke means that it's burning, which means carcinogens, yada, yada, yada. So that's what I'll say about oil. So I'll get I love this brand. I also love Costco. They have really high quality olive oils. And then giant jugs of coconut and avocado oil. So Costco is my love because they have such great suppliers and great sourcers. So let me see how I'm going to do this. I'm going to switch to this camera if we can find it, so that you can see my meat.
They can see it on this one too.
Oh, they can?
Like said right here is right
Here, I can
over the camera.
actually.
Oh, really?
So here is also, we're in the middle of a cooking. Okay. So here's my meat. I cooked it for 15 to 20 minutes. I then let it rest for 15. So pro chef tip, which I know the chefs will appreciate, you gotta let your meat rest. Otherwise, all the juice will run out when you cut into it right away. I know you get super hungry and it looks really good. You have to let your meat rest for a little bit. It also makes sure that it will stop cooking at approximately like the right temperature that you want. If you're unsure, use a thermometer. That's the easiest way to do it. But for the people that are more comfortable, this is a good way to do it as well. So I'm gonna move my meat over to the center of the table so we can start plating. I have to find. I'll move all these extra cameras point towards the center. So let's see how we did, friends. So we're just gonna cut right down the center of that bone, right between the bones. So it's about a medium, so depending on how you like it. Some people like it really bloody. This is A-okay by me. And part of the reason too why we salt the outside coating is because it will mellow out when you bite into the inside, which doesn't have quite that salt seasoning.
And that salt is also tenderizing. It has a really important function in cooking. So it draws the moisture out, which allows all those fats to caramelize and all those sugars to caramelize. It's really important.
And I hope you can hear Jenny. She was talking about caramelizing meat using salt, which sounds the opposite, but it's an important chemical reaction that supports it. So if you're looking in the correct camera, you can see that as I go towards the center, you can actually see that it's more pink. So if you have multiple people at your table that like different temperatures, you can always choose which cuts they get when you're plating your food. So just remember how easy that was. I literally seared it with salt and pepper.
One,
I gave it a massage,
Swan.
and then I threw it in the oven for 15 minutes. 15 minutes if you wanted a little bit more rare than this. 20 minutes if you like it more medium. Again, you can always use a thermometer, but super easy.
So I think we're gonna go ahead and set up our plates, and we're actually going to eat. And if you are cooking along, or if you've been watching but have food, we invite you also to eat. I always like to remind people to take a deep breath or two, and just remember that I like to think about all the hands that touched the food that I'm consuming before it got to me. I like to think of the environment and how the choices that I make are also choices I'm making to sustain my environment and my community. But also mindful eating, those breaths tell your body that it's time to absorb nutrients. And that is really, really important. Our body is, if it's in fight or flight mode, it's actually not going to absorb the nutrients, even if the food is good for us. So our body needs to know it's time to absorb those nutrients and engage with their food. So that's what we want you all to do. And then I guess we've got a little time for questions if there are questions.
We love questions.
Yes, we do.
I'm gonna spoon this up. I'm gonna spoon this up in bowls.
Okay.
Will you explain to us what you're serving up there? It looks delicious. Remind us what you're putting on the plate, Jenny.
Oh, it's good. 15 minutes left, so. And during our ongoing sessions or one-on-one sessions, we'll go more deeply into some of these more complex topics. And then, you know, with any new concept, you know, sometimes questions come up later. Sometimes it's nice to hear things more than once. So we'll try to repeat the most important concepts as they come up.
Is there a question?
If folks have questions, I invite them to put them in the chat area and I can ask those aloud for you.
Yeah, this is on. This is on.
Oh, they can hear us?
Maybe if you turn that towards all of us and then we can just be in that camera. Can you all see us?
Patient participants, just give us a few minutes here to reset up the cameras and the microphones so we can watch our guests eat and
We'll
talk
also
about what they're
accept
eating,
comments.
and accept comments
Yeah, we
and
cannot
answer your questions.
cannot see her here. That's from my mother.
They can't hear.
Yeah, they can't hear on that microphone. That's why we're doing the.
All right, I'm gonna.
Do you have your can? Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Put it
Suan, we
on
can hear
mine,
you
so I
well.
think Mic is good. All right, it sounds like those last comments maybe
Yep.
you couldn't hear. And so I'm gonna just repeat them. We were talking about just the meat and the salt and how important the salt is for caramelization. I think Suan was able to say that. We talked about plating. Obviously, oh, I know, I was talking about mindful eating. So I'll talk a little bit more about that because I do think that's really important. So I always teach people and remind people, I do this at home too, to take a couple deep breaths before eating your food. It tells your body that it is time to digest. We call that rest and digest. That's what mindfulness is telling your body. Otherwise, most of the time we are going around in fight or flight mode. We are on guard, we're protecting ourselves from danger. And when we're in that mode, we actually aren't going to absorb the nutrients that are in our food. Even if it's healthy food, our body's just not prepared to absorb those nutrients. And so that signal to our body that, yep, it's time to eat, food's coming in, you should take it in and you should absorb it, is such a way of honoring your body and the food, right? Appreciating where it came from, all the hands that brought it to you, and now the fact that you have the luxury or the opportunity to enjoy and indulge in this deliciousness that's good for you. So I see Lachelle nodding over there. It looks like it's tasty. I'm excited to do that. So if you were cooking along or if you're just going to eat with us, I encourage you to take a few deep breaths, really take in the smells, and then sit down and really enjoy your food. I see, let's see.
I got a couple questions. So we got a question about additional spice combination for the collards. I mean, the spice combinations are limitless. I like spice, you know, like heat in my collard greens. So I would probably do something with heat. You know, you could do jalapenos. You could throw some cayenne in there. You could do a Berber spice, which is an African.
They would be yummy in the tempeh sauce too.
What the collard greens? Yeah, put them in I make a big pot of collard greens once a week, and then I just like put them in everything that I'm eating. But yeah, as far as, I mean, you could use different aromatics. So when I cooked it down, you know, aromatics, I use onion and garlic, but you could use peppers. You could use, you know, green peppers, poblano peppers. You could use shallots, leeks, any type of aromatic. You could do fresh herbs like how Suan did thyme. You could put thyme in when you're cooking down the tomatoes. Honestly, I know we talked about how we veered from the recipe. I think of recipes more of as a guideline, rather, especially when you're cooking. Now, baking can be a little bit more strict, but you can. I like veering from a recipe. Once I know the mechanics of it, I'm probably going to look at the recipe and see what I have that fits it more than trying to go and buy something. Like maybe it, you know, has one kind of pepper, and I have a green pepper, and it calls for a poblano, whatever, you know, just things that when you can start matching up the profiles of textures in ingredients and flavors and how those break down, then you can start substituting ingredients, especially when you're cooking. Absolutely. Woo! Woo!
So sorry, I'm gonna just add, I love what Lachelle, it's so cool how, something's on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's so cool how we are all kind of saying the same thing in our own language or our own way, because this idea of tapping into this formula or this template and then just plugging things in. So Swan talked about how her mom cooked with, you know, some kind of protein and a bunch of vegetables and then rice, but you know, the polenta is our grain today in this dish. As any particular in specific ingredient is up to you, but there's that general sort of lots and lots of vegetables with some protein and some whole grains, and then really what ties it together is the delicious spices and fats that you're using to create flavor. And then it's true, it's limitless, and it's really kind of fun.
Yeah, can I go?
Yeah.
Hold on a second. Sorry, we got to keep switching between the cameras. I just wanted to say this one thing. We all planned our dishes separately. I mean, we talked about what we were going to do, but we didn't plan this meal to kind of go that cohesively together. We just kind of, Jenny picked their dish, Swan picked her dish, I picked my dish, and all of them are working together really well. I feel like we've created some synergy in this class and with this meal. So yeah, awesome. Let's see. There's a couple more questions. The next question was, in order for the world's people to eat like you are cooking tonight, what would need to change to supply good nutrition for everyone? Man, that's a question. That's a deep question. Before Jenny goes, I'm gonna say, because so I told you all about my business and some of the things I do, but I also work at the Good Acre, which is a food hub. And we work with local farmers, and we were having a similar discussion today, really about equity and who has access to food and what kind of foods and what quality foods. And so that's really the issue that has to be addressed, is access. How does everyone get access to the food regardless of their standing, economic standing, or their social standing? How can everyone get access? And then it's not just access to the food, it's education. Where does the food come from? Knowing that it comes not from the grocery store, but from a farm or from a garden or from the land or from an animal. Understanding that, and then understanding what to do with the food. When, you know, it's great to know where a potato comes from, but if I don't know how to make it taste good, you know, and that's the thing. One more thing that I have to say about flavors is that I feel like we've sold ourselves short on flavors. We always think that healthy things don't taste good, or that, you know, if we're going to eat a pot of collard greens, that's not appealing because of the flavors, but the flavors are there. It's just a matter of how we cook, how we build the flavors. So if I don't put salt on this meat, it's not going to taste any better than, actually a red pepper would taste a lot better just raw if I bit into it than a piece of red meat. I have to season it. I have to do things to it. And just understanding that you can take one ingredient like a carrot and you can cut it, you can shave it, you can dice it, You can puree it. You could turn it into pasta. You could do a lot of different things with that one vegetable, right? And so if we can understand how we can coax flavors out of vegetables on an individual basis and how they can come together, we can get more out of the food that we're creating and stop selling ourselves short, thinking that we're not going to get deliciousness just because we're getting nutrition. So that's my.
As long as everybody can hear me. I think the question also about making sure that everyone has nutrition goes back to what Lachelle was talking about with equity. And nothing displays that or demonstrates how important that is than like what's happening right now in Texas. So for those people that don't think that climate matters or that climate change matters, we can't get everybody equal access to food if there isn't a consistent environment in which to produce it. And then also we've created a situation right now where most of the world's food supply is concentrated in specific areas and only specific foods get subsidized by governments. So the reason why there's so much corn, the reason why there's so much wheat is because that's where the money is going. So when we talk about public policy in our country, actually actively having that conversation and making sure that these big corporations that have big commodity investments aren't the only ones driving the conversation, because a lot of those subsidies should be going to organic farmers, to people that are trying to do sustainable agriculture and meat production, because again, that's better for our whole society. So equity can't really exist until we start to look at the systems that are producing the food, because where the money goes is where the change happens or where the lack of change happens.
Nice. Yeah. I don't really have to repeat what both of them said. Oh, sorry. Because they both said it so well. I'll just add that it's, you know, we have gotten to this point in society where we see food as a privilege instead of a right. And food is a fundamental human right, just like healthy air and clean water. And so we have to sort of tackle it, in my mind, and I've been working in this space for almost 30 years in the nonprofit community. We have to tackle it in the healthcare system. We have to tackle it at the policy rate level. We have to tackle it in the community. And I really, really believe that supporting sustainable agriculture, supporting education. I work with teachers who don't even really know anything about how to talk about where food comes from. I work with doctors who don't know how to talk about it. They don't even really know how to guide their patients to cooking healthy food. So it's a sort of multi-level effort. But what I do think is really important is that we are all systems are connected to food. And so people who work in finance, that is entirely related to food. And people who work in tech, that's entirely related to food. And obviously agriculture is, and obviously health is. But every single system that we are a part of in society is connected to food. Food is fundamental for everyone. And so I just think we have to speak up, we have to challenge people, we have to demand that access is created. And sometimes that means that we have to give something up in order to make that, you know, happen for the greater good. So it's an ongoing, long process. It is a marathon, definitely not a sprint.
Journey, not necessarily.
It's a journey, not a destination. And one thing I will say is that, as I said, I've been in this space for a long time and I have seen change. So I do feel that things can change, but we have to really stay with it. We have to do this work over and over and over and over again. And absolutely vote with your dollars. You're a consumer, you have, to whatever degree you can, you have to demand what you need that's better for all of us. And, you know, again, there's a lot of privilege involved in a lot of what we're talking about. And I acknowledge that and I'm aware of that. And I try to always be mindful of how I can use whatever privilege I have towards some of these goals.
So the next question is actually for you. So you can say it. That's
Okay.
Well, just the last question, then you can answer this quickly. It said, in order for the world's people to eat like you're cooking tonight, what would need to change to supply good nutrition? Oh,
that was already.
No, I'm sorry. The next one. Jenny spoke about inhaling before you eat. Most people will have a glass of wine or drink with food. Good or bad? Wait after or have it earlier?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, I
They
would
probably
say,
didn't hear me.
oh, the question was a glass of wine, good or bad, with food before or after. So I think honestly, it's entirely up to you if you're talking about one glass of wine with your food. I think there's flexibility. I think alcohol on an empty stomach gets you drunk pretty quickly. So if but if you're following it up with food, food's going to absorb some of that. So I would say if it's one glass of wine, that's an appropriate, amount of alcohol to have, especially if you are eating. And then, it's just appropriate to have a reasonable amount of alcohol. I personally think having wine just before I eat or with my meal is more enjoyable than having it after I eat, because then I'm really full and I don't find it comfortable. Okay, Swan's gonna add, and then we do kind of have to wrap up, I think.
So the other consideration when it comes to beverages, this is more of a physiology consideration. So for those who are struggling with something like type 2 diabetes, it's important to make sure that you're pairing any carbohydrate that you eat with a protein and likely a healthy fat. So one way to keep your blood sugar level, and this counts for everybody, is to have protein first before you start diving into any carbohydrate that you have in your meal. And obviously you want to make sure that you're keeping your servings in moderation, but you can keep your blood sugar at a more even level if you have that wine with your food. But also it comes down to, like, from a chef's perspective, it's a pairing. So if it's an appropriately paired wine, like, why would you not want to have it with the rest of your meal as a part of it, right? So if you're thinking about it from a culinary perspective, it's real, it's easy to just have it with the dish. Yes, exactly. And then I think there was a question about pork tenderloin. So I usually do some kind of like a nutty, like, spiced mixture, like a 5-spice, and then you can mellow it out with a little bit of something creamy. I'm sure we can even talk about that as a group and then send out a note before or during our next session to give you some ideas on. Yeah, because we're running out of time. Please send us any additional questions, and we're happy to get back to you as our panel, and then also during our individual sessions. Yeah, because you can see through the rest of the classes that we're going to be having over this series, there's going to be one-on-one time with each of us individually. So if you want to dive into some of our expertises, feel free to hold on to those questions or send them through so we can incorporate them into the class. Yeah, and I figure as a close, we could each go around and talk about how you can find us in between classes here, and make sure that you can stay connected. So I'll start. My name is Suan with a U, so it's not hard to find me. You just Google it and Suan Kregel, and trust me, I'll pop right up. But my nutrition, my well-being, my advocacy work I do under the banner of Unfiltered Reality. So on social media, I'm 2020 Unfiltered Reality, and then my website is unfiltered-reality.com. And then I do all of my tech consulting work under Convergence Point Consulting. So feel free to reach out to me. Happy to answer questions. I also do all of my strength and well-being coaching underneath the Unfiltered Reality, or Elevate Wellness in Richfield. They're my partner, my partner in crime. Jonathan and Constantina, they're the owners, are wonderful, and I actually do train out of that space as well.
I think Mike was trying to talk to us. Is your speaker on?
It is not.
Mike,
Now it's on.
Mike, are you trying to talk to us? Our speaker, we keep having to turn our microphones and speakers off. I was saying I'm going to put it all that information in the chat.
Oh, okay, great. So you want to pass it on to Jenny?
Sure. I'm guessing Mike is going to share this with all of you. And of course, as Suan mentioned, we'll have more chances to talk. My website is transformingthetable, all one word.com. I have a cookbook called Cooking Up the Good Life. You can find that on Amazon or the University of Minnesota Press or through my website. And I am around and teaching in multiple settings at the university and in the community. And I'm always up for a new project and a new collaboration.
I'm Chef Lachelle Cunningham. You can find me through my website, LachelleCunningham.com. I think Mike put that in the chat. You can also find me on social media at Lachelle Cunningham. If you follow me on Facebook, you'll find out more about when I'm doing different classes. I have all kinds of classes. We have this series. I'm offering a series through Mississippi Market, my full series called Beyond Soul Food, where we dig into soul food history, nutritional healing, and social justice. And then I also teach a food business class. So people who are interested in going into food business, I teach that through the Neighborhood Development Center. So you can find out more about all of that in my upcoming classes, like I said, mostly at this point on social media. So Facebook is the way to find out about my upcoming events. And then my website is going to be where you can learn more about me. And I hope to see you all in our upcoming classes. We have a lot more to dig into. We're all going to individually go deeper into the topics that we've chosen. And so we look forward to seeing you all there and with us. And we're going to be there with each other, but we'll all be on Zoom at our separate houses. So we won't have, now that we have experience with this, in our last class, we're going to come back together again. And I think we're going to have some ways to make it even better than it was today. But we appreciate you all sticking with us for all this time. All right, so that's it. Bye, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it. We hope you all enjoyed. We're just waving by at that camera. I'm waving by at this camera. We have so many cameras. So good to see all your faces. Thank you. The whole 2 said we were great.
Thank you. Bye.